Creating private fortunes and social discontent. The Civil War was a watershed in American philanthropy, as it was in nearly all aspects of American life. It was a great wrenching experience in American history, spreading death and destruction, stimulating industrial development, and producing corporate philanthropy, which refers to philanthropy characteristics of corporate capitalism, especially foundations that are philanthropic corporations controlled by members of the corporate class. Wholesale philanthropy. Upheavals within and between all classes of Americans, a new kind of philanthropy tailored to those new conditions emerged in the decades following the war. The Civil War not only freed the black slaves from legal bonds of slavery, it also freed the hand of the Northern capital to extend throughout the nation the industrial transformation it had begun mainly north of the Ohio River. As the Underground Railroad was the vehicle and symbol of freedom for antebellum slaves, the Iron Railroad was the vehicle and symbol of industrialization and the ascending capitalist class. As the railroads were used increasingly to move troops and supplies for Union armies, they helped extend and integrate the marketplace, making possible a specialized manufacturing and marketing system that could be coordinated across the continent. The railroads pushed into every region of the country. They brought farm produce to new markets, to ports for shipment to distant lands. They carried cotton from southern fields to New England textile mills. They carried iron ore from Lake Superior to the iron mills and new Bessemer steel furnaces in Pittsburgh, and oil from western Pennsylvania to Cleveland refineries. And they brought the products from the nation's factories to markets in every region. Everywhere they spread new settlements and development. Despite interruptions during the Civil War, railroad construction added 62,000 miles of new lines in the 1860s and 1870s, tripling the nation's existing track mileage. Railroad construction required iron and later steel rails and bridges. The railroad themselves soon became the biggest customers of America's growing steel industry. The Civil War and the railroads led some men to their pots of gold. Andrew Carnegie began his rise to fortune as a telegraph clerk for the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1853. By the beginning of the Civil War, the ambitious 25-year-old Carnegie was well into railroad management and spent a few months organizing rail transport and telegraph communications for the War Department. But Carnegie quit his exciting and dangerous war front job and returned to the Pennsylvania, and especially to tend his growing investment in iron manufacturing and coal mining. By 1863, his annual income exceeded $40,000. John David Rockefeller's fortunes were also helped by the Civil War. In 1861, as the war consumed the energies and lives of Northerners and Southerners, the 25-year-old Rockefeller was building a successful merchandising firm in Cleveland. As war orders poured in, commodity prices rose sharply, and Rockefeller's profits soared. 2 years later, Rockefeller had saved enough capital to invest in an oil refining business, and by the end of the war, he was worth enough to take control of the company. By 1880, led by Rockefeller's determination to make money and steal more money, combined with relentless competition in the marketplace and rebates extracted from the railroads, his Standard Oil Company was refining 95% of the country's oil. While the industrial base had obviously been growing in the decades before the Civil War, it was the changes wrought by the war that cemented the new system structure. The Southern patrician class, whose position was based on agriculture and slaves, was not crushed, but its subordination to the Northern-controlled capitalist economy was assured. The factory system was extended with the railroad, and an industrial working class was formed out of craftsmen and laborers, native folk and immigrants. Small-town America gradually gave way to industrial and commercial boom, and cities grew faster than their fragile tenements could be built. In the process, older entrepreneurs and landed gentry were displaced by the new entrepreneurs and their corporations. By the 1870s, for example, only 520 or 5% of the 10,395 businesses in Massachusetts were incorporated. But this 5% held 96% of the total capital and employed 60% of all workers. By 1900, 3/4 of all manufactured goods were produced by corporations. Because of the important logistical role of the railroads, the Civil War has been called the First Railroad War. Yet the war did not rely on an industrial economy. As William Applebaum Williams aptly put it, the Civil War produced an industrial system rather than being fought with one. The ultimate victors of the war were the corporations and the men who, for the most part, ruled the new economy. Not all was as smooth for the new barons of the corporate economy, nor did they make life easy for those under them. The owners of each industry, driven to grab what they could of the available market and accumulate as much capital as possible in the shortest time, pushed wages down in order to lower prices and to get a jump on their competitors. Immigrants were inducted into a growing industrial workforce. Some 16 million foreign-born were attracted to the country in the second half of the 19th century, totaling 15% of the population by 1890 and nearly a quarter of the population of the industrialized northeastern states. Craftsmen saw their skills, the basis of modest security and pride, fall to degradation and unemployment before machines that outproduce them and factories that oppress them. Migrants from failing farms and immigrants from foreign lands filled the factories and cities of the New World. Working men lost their livelihoods or submitted to the harshest labors. Women were drawn out of more traditional homebound work into factories, shops, and stores. 20% of the nation's women were wage laborers by 1900. Children were sucked into the factories as the cheapest labor. Working-class family and social life were shaken and devastated. Exploitation of workers, unmitigated by either legal restraints or humanitarianism, led to increased organizing by labor. The Depression of the 1870s brought wages in 1875 down to $1.50 for a 10-hour day. Riots were common in cities throughout the country. Labor began to organize, and employers used every available power, from lockouts to Pinkertons, to crush the union movement. In 1877, the first nationwide strike, a spreading walkout against the railroads, was put down with a bloodbath that took the lives of scores of workers, their families, and their supporters in city slums around the country. The labor movement grew, and strikes continued to spread in the 1880s and 1890s. The Haymarket Square bomb in 1886, the strike at Carnegie's Homestead steel mills in 1892, and the Pullman strike in 1894 were only the most prominent events that made employers and their allies fear for the continued existence of their society. The times are strangely out of joint, worried a Kentucky politician. The rich grow richer, the poor become poorer, the nation trembles. Townfolk and farmers, especially in the Midwest and South, felt their lives and livelihoods increasingly determined by railroad rates and lines of credit from banks directed from distant cities. Semi-feudal sharecropping kept large numbers of Southern farmers in perpetual debt and poverty. Agrarian opposition to capitalist expansion won broad support. In 1896, the growing Populist Party formed a shallow coalition with the Democratic Party around the Democratic Bryan for president and the populist Tom Watson for vice president against McKinley, the candidate of big business. The Populist Party was decimated by their defeat, but populist resistance to capitalist wealth and control of agriculture continued in the Granges and the Farmers Union well into the new century. To the middle-class professionals who dominated the progressive movement, the society seemed to be breaking up below them because of the greed of those above them. They called for reforms and to limit the concentration of power and wealth. Many members of the richer class felt called upon to justify the great inequality that angered the working class and worried the middle class. Naturally, they did not see themselves as idle rich. They viewed their efforts to build industrial empires as productive work, and they considered all the people to be beneficiaries of those empires. No one said it as well as Rockefeller. The best philanthropy, the help that does the most good and the least harm, the help that nourishes civilization at its very root, the most widely disseminates health, righteousness, and happiness, is not what is usually called charity. It is, in my judgment, the investment of effort or time or money carefully considered with relation to the power of employing people at a remunerative wage, to expand and develop the resources at hand, and to give opportunity for progress and healthful labor where it did not exist before. No mere money giving is comparable to this in its lasting and beneficial results. End quote. The great benefit of such enterprises is moral, providing employment to the otherwise idle hands, and material. To multiply, to cheapen, and to diffuse as universally as possible the comforts of life. Thus, the building up of private industry is the best method of solving the problems that have historically grew with industrialization. Can there be any doubt that cheapening the cost of necessities and conveniences of life is the most powerful agent of civilization's progress? Asked Charles Eliot Perkins, president of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. The true gospel, Perkins philosophized agreeably, is to enable men to acquire the comforts and conveniences of life by their own efforts, and then they will be wise and good. The class of men and women who provided this largesse for the rest of society had varied notions about what to do with their money and their power. Mark Hanna, a Cleveland industrialist, showed fellow capitalists that the president and executive branch of the government, as well as the Congress, could be secured for the protection of our business interests. Fearing the growing ranks of populists and their increasing political strength, he established an interlocking political directorate of corporate leaders to organize their common interests and bring their influence more directly into the federal government. With their first presidential triumph, electing McKinley in 1896, they inaugurated the modern system of expensive, centrally coordinated national campaigns. Hanna led the formation of a corporate politics that placed the broad class interest of industrialists and financiers ahead of pork-barrel tactics favoring narrow interests that had dominated state, national, and local political scenes. Hanna and other leaders of this class put together new audiences like the National Civic Federation, with some labor leaders to create harmony of interests out of the class conflicts that threatened the new economic order. The progressive movement proved an ideal vehicle for the business class to assert its interests by securing additional needed capital from Congress and through reforms in the federal executive branch, creating and controlling regulatory agencies to bring order and consolidation to a number of industries. The politically wise leaders of this class thus demonstrated that with strategic alliances with social reformers and conservative union officials, the nation's political institutions could be reformed to serve the needs of the corporate order. Not all capitalists, however, could see further than their own immediate interest in politics. John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil Trust was accused by Henry Demarest Lloyd of buying out the legislatures and executive branches of Pennsylvania and Ohio, was unenthusiastic about his friend Hanna's broader political strategy. Hanna's first major success sent John Sherman to the U.S. Senate in 1885, ironically providing the author of the very law under which the Standard Empire was eventually broken up. Perhaps Rockefeller suspected such betrayals from politicians who had their own visions of what was good for business, for he customarily reserved his political contributions for candidates closer to the Standard's immediate field of operations. Many wealthy men spent their fortunes on ostentatious luxury that left much of European aristocracy in a shadow. The Vanderbilts, Jim Fisk, Jay Gould, and other financiers built palaces along New York's Fifth Avenue, many of them with marble furnishings and statuary scooped up from the crumbling baronies of the Old World. Marshall Field and Potter Palmer built their castles on some of Chicago's most prized residential and lakefront land. Mark Hopkins and Charles Crocker and Leland Stanford transformed San Francisco's Nob Hill with their residence of splendor, using wealth obtained from promoting and governing the westward expansions of the railroads. Carnegie bought himself a castle in his Scottish homeland, and Rockefeller created not merely a castle but a royal estate in Pocatico Hills, whose 3,500 acres overlooking the Hudson River was 5 times the size of Central Park. The spectacle of such living, especially in the midst of a tenement-teeming cities, caused considerable agitation. The Massachusetts Board of Education had complained even in 1849, quote, "One gorgeous palace absorbs all the labor and expense that might have been made 1,000 hovels comfortable." By the end of the century, social scientists cultivated by the wealthy came to their benefactors' defense. A Boston University economics professor retorted to the detractors of grandeur, "The notion there is necessarily any causal connection between opulence and poverty is too crude to require serious refutation." Driving the reluctant poor from poverty. Some representatives of the opulent class, both before and after the Civil War, had a broader sense of purpose. They provided luxuries, even princely lives for themselves and their families, but they carefully set aside a share of their wealth for philanthropy. Philanthropy, of course, did not mean giving money directly to the poor. While charity had always implied providing alms for the relief of the poor, the rich and most social reformers in the class immediately below the rich have always been wary of the consequences of giving to the poor. Cotton Mather urged colonial Boston merchants to set a disciplined moral example and give only to the poor that can't work. Benjamin Franklin hoped to provide sufficient opportunity in society so there would be no need of poverty, and he tried to develop a strategy for getting the poor to adopt disciplined ways of living. "I think the best way of doing good to the poor," Franklin said, "is not making them easy in poverty, but leading them or driving them out of it." Franklin's maxim and the pitiless social Darwinist perspective were the heart of the charity organization movement that blossomed in the United States during the last 3 decades of the century. Patterned after the London Charity Organization Society, founded in 1869, these city and national organizations gave few handouts. Their main purpose was, in the words of a Philadelphia group, to develop a method by which idleness and begging, now so encouraged, may be suppressed and worthy self-respecting poverty be discovered and relieved at the smallest cost to the benevolent. Even during the vast depression that began in 1873 and lasted until the end of that decade, all takers of charity were suspected of slothfulness and degeneracy. The poor were a desperate, volatile lot, given to crimes, riots, and insolent discontent. Extreme social Darwinists believe, with Herbert Spencer, that those who are fit to live to do so, and those who are not fit to die, and it is best they should die. But the dominant classes of any society need a more positive program than that to deal with oppressed classes' articulated demands for sharing the wealth or even their inarticulate mayhem. The programs that emerged from charity organization work brought systemic study, a label of science, to philanthropic work. The annual meetings of the National Conference of Charities and Correction brought together experts from charity organizations, administrators, and penal institutions, hospitals, and settlement houses, academics from university sociology and economics departments, and clergymen and physicians to coordinate their work and develop strategies for uplifting the poor. The attitudes of these scientific charity workers ran from harsh to refined, punitive to ameliorative. Over the years, these reformers turned increasingly to the analytic methods of the social sciences and to the political views of the progressive movement. Eric T. Devine, in his presidential address to the National Conference in 1906, noted that inmates were entering charitable institutions, insane asylums, prisons, and reformatories faster than all our educational processes, our relief funds, and even our consecrated personal service have been able to rehabilitate them. The role of modern philanthropy, Devine continued, is to seek out and to strike effectively at those organized forces of evil and those particular causes of dependence and intolerable living conditions which are beyond the control of the individuals whom they injure and whom they too often destroy. Scientific philanthropy must concern itself with prevention rather than relief, argued Amos Warner, a Stanford economist active in the movement. Warner compared statistics compiled by charity organizations in the United States and Europe and concluded that nearly three-fourths of all poverty is due to a personal or social misfortune and less than a fourth of misconduct on the part of the individual. Prevention involved intervening in the lives of both groups to assist them through their misfortune or change their bad habits and lead them onto the path of righteousness. Out of this social intervention perspective and the charity organization movement emerged the social work professions. Caseworkers, settlement house workers, correctional administrators, probation officers, and their academic advisors shared with the middle and upper classes the prevailing social Darwinist view that dependent poverty, crime, and social deviance in general had biological roots. But this new professional class believed that medical and social intervention could remedy natural imperfections. Given the disintegration of older social relations and increasing fear of working class revolt, both products of capitalist industrialization, it is not surprising that wealthy men and women supported the goals and programs of the charity organizations and the social work movement. Charles Hall, who amassed a fortune from Chicago's booming real estate market, gave freely to social rehabilitation programs in the slums and sold cheap land to the poor to give them a stake in the existing society. It was his way of correcting the unequal distribution of land, out of which he feared discontent and revolution will come. Scorning pity and indiscriminate relief as merely reinforcing the poor in their degraded condition, the charity organization movement, social work professions, and wealthy benefactors in general worked instead to uplift or rehabilitate the poor. They established institutions that would isolate the poor that can't work and prevent them from infecting honest, hard-working poor folk. They also developed programs to give the working poor a loftier vision of life that could otherwise be gotten from the factories and tenements in which they spent their lives. Settlement houses and social workers were established in the slums and ghettos to integrate the foreign-born into American society and to rehabilitate and reintegrate the casualties of an industrial society divided into owners and non-owners. Jane Addams' settlement house, provided by Charles Hall's estate, attempted to fulfill her principal goals to feed the mind of the worker, to lift it above the monotony of his task, and to connect it with the larger world outside of his immediate surroundings. Adams opposed the excesses of both capital and labor and worked to bring together these warring classes through programs acceptable to both. Such programs did not suggest that the capitalist social structure itself should be altered. Rather, they were intended to ameliorate the harsh conditions of capitalism by helping individuals escape from its pits and lead both useful and more satisfying lives. While many social workers supported union demands, their work won financial and political support from wealthy classes because it diverted attention from more militant demands. Social workers held out the hope of ameliorating living conditions with social programs while workers demanded union recognition, higher pay, an 8-hour day, and relief from unemployment. All these programs proved more symbolic and ideological than actually ameliorative. The working poor and the unemployed were being taught to blame their own inadequacies for their conditions and to work and wait patiently for their individual rewards. Some capitalists, however, both before and after the Civil War, were less concerned with revolt brewing below them and were more thoughtful about their future needs of the social system. They developed another line of philanthropy that centered on creating social institutions whose main functions were not even symbolic amelioration, but provided for the training of personnel needed by industrial capitalism if it was to survive and grow. Some of these capitalists, particularly in the first half of the 19th century, helped to create compulsory public schooling to socialize working class and poor children to the rhythms and the cooperative needs of factory work and to give them the rudimentary skills, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and vocational skills needed in an industrial society. Other men and women of wealth understood that the country's need for more advanced technical skills. They joined forces with foresighted leaders of the nation's traditional colleges, bringing them out of the orbit of the old agricultural and merchant ruling class and into the service of the ascending industrial and financial order.